The small town of Blackwood, nestled deep in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, was known for its dense forests, misty mountains, and eerie silence. It was the kind of place where the trees seemed to whisper secrets to those who dared to listen. For 5 friends, Lila, Carter, Noah, Rachel, and Tyler, it was the perfect destination for a weekend hiking trip. They had all met in college in Seattle and had been inseparable ever since. But this trip would test their bond in ways they could never have imagined. The invitation came from Carter, who had stumbled upon an old map of Blackwood Forest while browsing a flea market in Portland. The map was hand-drawn, with cryptic symbols and notes scrawled in the margins. It promised a hidden trail that led to a secluded waterfall untouched by tourists. The group was intrigued, and after weeks of planning, they packed their gear and set off for Blackwood. As they drove into the town, the atmosphere grew heavier. The streets were empty, and the few locals they passed gave them wary glances. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark canopy stretching as far as the eye could see. The group checked into a small motel on the edge of town, where the owner, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, warned them about the forest. "Folks around here don't go into those woods," he said, his voice low. "There's something wrong with that place. People go in, but they don't always come out." The friends laughed it off, dismissing his warning as superstition. But as they settled into their rooms that night, Lila couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The next morning, the group set out early, their backpacks loaded with supplies. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The trail was well marked at first, but as they ventured deeper, the path grew narrower and more overgrown. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisted and gnarled. Carter led the way, holding the old map in his hands. "According to this, we should reach the waterfall by midday," he said, his voice filled with excitement. But as the hours passed, the group began to notice strange things. The symbols on the map didn't match the landmarks they were passing. The trail markers they had been following suddenly disappeared, leaving them disoriented. The forest grew darker, the sunlight barely penetrating the thick canopy above. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Rachel asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Carter frowned, studying the map. "I think so, but something feels off." As they pressed on, the forest seemed to change around them. The trees grew taller, their trunks blackened and scarred. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest faded into an eerie silence. The group huddled closer together, their unease growing with every step. By nightfall, the group had still not reached the waterfall. Exhausted and disoriented, they decided to set up camp in a small clearing. The fire they built provided little warmth, and the shadows cast by the flames seemed to dance and twist unnaturally. As they sat around the fire, Noah told a story he had heard about Blackwood Forest. "They say this place is cursed," he began, his voice low. "Back in the 1800s, a group of settlers disappeared here. Their bodies were never found, but some say their spirits still roam the forest, looking for others to take their place." Lila shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "That's just a story, right?" But before Noah could answer, they heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the crackling fire. It sounded like their names, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. "Lila, Carter, Noah." The group froze, their eyes darting to the dark edges of the clearing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening. "Who's there?" Tyler called out, his voice trembling, but there was no response. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The next morning, the group woke to find Tyler's tent empty. His backpack and sleeping bag were still there, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in as they searched the surrounding area, calling his name. "Tyler, where are you?" Rachel shouted, her voice echoing through the trees. But there was no reply. The forest seemed to swallow their voices whole. Carter examined the ground around Tyler's tent. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a set of footprints leading away from the camp. "He must have wandered off during the night." "But why would he leave without his gear?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. The group followed the footprints, which led them deeper into the woods. The trail became increasingly difficult to navigate, with thick underbrush and fallen trees blocking their path. After hours of searching, they found themselves at the edge of a steep ravine. The footprints ended abruptly, as if Tyler had vanished into thin air. As the day wore on, the group's unease grew. The forest seemed to grow darker, even though it was still midday. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, but always just out of earshot. The others heard them too, but they tried to brush it off as the wind. By nightfall, they had set up camp again. The fire provided little comfort, and the group huddled close, their nerves on edge. Carter suggested they turn back in the morning, but Noah insisted they keep looking for Tyler. As they settled into their tents, Lila heard the whispers again. This time they were louder, more insistent. She tried to ignore them, but they grew louder and louder, until they were almost deafening. "Lila, come to us." She clapped her hands over her ears, but the whispers persisted. She felt a strange compulsion to follow them, to leave the safety of the camp and venture into the dark woods. She fought the urge, but it was overwhelming. The next morning, Layla was gone. The remaining 3 friends searched frantically, but there was no trace of her. The whispers had grown louder, and they could no longer ignore them. They realized too late that the stories were true. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. As they tried to retrace their steps, the trail seemed to shift and change, leading them in circles. The trees closed in around them, their branches reaching out like claws. The whispers grew louder, more menacing, until they were all that the group could hear. One by one, they succumbed to the forest call. Carter was the first to disappear, lured away by the whispers. Rachel and Noah tried to stick together, but the forest had other plans. They were separated, and Noah vanished into the darkness. Rachel was the last one left. She ran through the woods, her heart pounding, but the forest seemed endless. The whispers were deafening now, and she could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent closing in around her. As she stumbled into a clearing, she saw them, the spirits of the forest, their forms shifting and indistinct, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They surrounded her, their whispers filling her mind. "Join us!" Rachel tried to resist, but it was no use. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others. Weeks later, a search party found the group's abandoned car at the trailhead. There was no sign of them, and the forest gave up no secrets. Blackwood Forest was closed to the public, but the locals knew the truth. The forest was alive, and it was always hungry.